from the floor? Seeing none, we will proceed with our agenda. This morning we have a presentation from Secretary Laura Howard as an overview of the Kansas Department of Children and Families. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm glad to be back with you again this week, this time to talk about the Department for Children and Families. I just have a brief overview, as you had requested, just to give an overview of the agency, a few current highlights. So we will start with the slide deck. The first slide, just sort of a reminder to the committee. I always like to kind of ground myself in kind of what the mission of the agency is. And for DCF, our mission is to protect children, strengthen families, and support adult self-sufficiency. So we really try to keep those things in mind in terms of those goals. And then I've also just given you some of the values that we do our work by on that first slide. The second slide is just an overall organizational chart of kind of the administrative part of our agency. And I do want to make one introduction for any new committee members. I do have Deputy Secretary Tanya Keys with me, who is our Deputy Secretary over Programs. Andrea Warnke, who is our legislative liaison, is not here this morning, but she was here with me last time, and you'll see her around the building. And I've also given you her contact information on the next page, as well as Jen Lee Randall, who's our Director of Public and Governmental Affairs. So anything that you need from us as an agency, you'll see Andrea running around here. You can contact one of them. And of course, you can always feel free to call me. I don't have any issue with that, but they may be more likely to maybe get the issue to the right person a little bit sooner. So again, in terms of our overall organizational structure at the administration level, we're really structured to have, one program Deputy Secretary, as I said, which is Tanya Keys. I also then have an Operations Deputy Secretary, Dan Levine, who's over all of the operations and finance. And I'll get into a little bit more of the regional structure in just a minute. On slide 5, DCF has...
Secretary Howard, if I could ask you to hold just a minute. How are we doing on getting the slides for people to be able to see? Working on it. Okay, go ahead.
I apologize. On slide 5, really just talks about the major programs that DCF operates. And we like to talk about those really in 4 buckets. We have and I'll go through each of those in just a little bit of detail. We have economic and employment supports, which are the traditional benefit programs. We have prevention and protection, which is the child and adult protective services, as well as family well-being, foster care. The third area is child support services. And the fourth area is rehabilitation services. At DCF, it's important also just to understand that we carry out much of our work through our regional offices and our service centers. So we have 36 service centers across the state that are organized into 6 regions. And so the vast majority of our staff are in those service centers. They're engaging with Kansans who are applying for benefits. They're investigating abuse and neglect and the like. They're supporting individuals who need vocational rehabilitation services. And so again, there's 36 service centers across the state. I'm going to start by talking about our largest of those kind of 4 program areas. That first area is prevention and protection services. And we have several directors in that area. We have a director of prevention, who's Jennifer Brett Snyder, a director of permanency, kind of over the foster care area, Rebecca Gerhardt. We also have directors of children's mental health and Medicaid, and some of our practice model and performance improvement. As I said, this is really the largest area of our agency by funding and staffing. And this is the part of our agency that really helps families and vulnerable adults by, first, the protection services that we have. So we operate through our Protection Report Center, both child abuse, child protective services, and adult protective services. So we investigate allegations of child abuse, we investigate allegations of adult abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Also within this arena, are a wide array of family support services. I'll speak a little bit more to a couple of those in a bit. But we've been really pleased over the last few years to be able to expand kind of the prevention part of this work. You know, a few years ago, if I stood before you, I would be talking to you primarily about foster care. We would have had some family preservation services, but in the last few years, we've been able to expand with your support and the governor's support a number of additional prevention services, including what we call Family First Prevention Services, to really support children to stay safely in their homes with their families in the community. This part of our agency also does have responsibility if a child does need to come into the custody of the secretary. This is the oversight for the foster care services, as well as adoption services for those youth who end up with a case plan goal of adoption, as well as some of the services for youth who are older youth in our care, really supporting them for preparation for independent living, particularly those youth who might age out of our services. We also have a regulatory function within prevention and protection services, so we also are the entity that's responsible for the licensing in this arena as well. So licensing of those family foster homes and any group foster home facilities. Just a quick summary on the next page that again just talks a little bit about caseload, just to give you a sense of kind of the scope and scale of some of that work. For example, we do around 25,000 child protective service investigations each year. We do about 11,000 adult protective service investigations each year. As we look at the context of foster care, the chart in your documents actually fiscal year 24 actual numbers, and we're actually at about 5,600 youth in foster care, and about 8,900 youth who are being supported through adoption support. Our foster care program in Kansas is really a public-private partnership. So when I talked about the work of the DCF staff, and I talked about child protective services, adult protective services, our field staff, do that front-end work that's really about the investigations and assessment. We receive those reports of abuse and neglect. We screen those. We do those investigations. If a child needs to come into care, we make a referral to one of our case management providers, and those are private partners who are under contract with us. And we do have a map in your testimony that shows you who those foster care case management providers are across the state. We have 5 of those across the state. We have KVC and Cornerstones. On the eastern part of the state, you'll see southeast part of the state, TFI, going over to South Central as well, TFI, Ember Hope in the Wichita area, and then St. Francis Ministries kind of in North Central and the western part of the state. Ember Hope is the newest. We rebid those contracts a year ago, and Region 7, the Wichita area, Sedgwick County, Ember Hope won that bid that had been managed through St. Francis prior to that. So again, we have those 5 case management providers who are responsible for the case plan work and the work with the families while children are in our care and custody. I do have a slide talking about children entering and exiting foster care across the years. I didn't want to put too much data in here, but we're really proud of the fact that for each year over the last 6 years, we've had fewer children entering care than exiting care. And overall, in terms of the number of youth in care, the total number of youth in care has gone down by about 27% in that time period. The number of children entering care each year has gone down more than 50%. And again, I would attribute that very much to some of the practice model work, and especially to the availability of those prevention services that allow us to support children safely in the community with their families, especially when there aren't issues of abuse. So just staying just a little bit longer on prevention and protection services, I did want to highlight those prevention services. So I do have on slide 10 just a description of Family First Prevention Services. These services just started in 2019. The federal government, until they passed what was called the Family First Prevention Services Act, didn't really have resources that states could really spend on the front end for prevention. Federal foster care dollars under what's called Title 4E of the Social Security Act really could just be used for foster care services. That federal act was kind of a game changer, and they structured that act in such a way that states could draw down federal matching funds for prevention services, but they needed to be evidence-based, and they needed to be in certain categories of services. The four categories are mental health, parent skill building, perhaps like a home visiting program, kinship navigation that might help family members who might need some legal support to care for a child, and in the area of substance use. Now, we were one of the really early adopters when the federal government made this available. The legislature that session very immediately did some tweaks in a couple laws that needed to happen, and very quickly supported the governor's recommendation for matching funds, and we kind of jumped right in. And a chief measure of the success, there's a lot of outcomes. We have a really extensive evaluation that's done with us through some partners at University of Kansas, but at the aggregate level, the goal, of course, is that children can remain safely at home. And so we measure the percent of children who are still at home after 12 months after the referral to the program. And our numbers range from 89 to 90% at any given range. I think at the point we put these slides together it was 89%. But our program goal is 90%. We have two categories, kinship navigation and mental health, that also came in at 100% and 90%. So we've made over 6,400 referrals of families to these services since they started in 2019. And as I said, about 90% of children and youth have stayed safely at home 12 months after referral. So again, that diversion from foster care. So this is a program, I don't have it in this slide deck, but we have providers all over the state. These are services that we awarded through grants. They'd be the sorts of programs that you might be familiar with, like on the home visiting side. Could be parents as teachers, could be other home visiting, could be specialized mental health services. For example, a service called multi-systemic therapy, which is very effective for older youth with behavioral issues. So we have these services, all across the state through various providers. Again, very, very proud of that, and very, very thankful to have had the support of the legislature in moving that forward. The other success story I just wanted to mention in terms of prevention and protection support services before I move on to kind of the second area of services is just the legislation that you supported last year, the SOL legislation that created a new legal permanency option for youth in our care. And as you'll recall, this was really an initiative led by former foster youth and current foster youth who said that, the current permanency options just didn't work for them. Some, half the youth who come into care go home, some are adopted, some might go to a guardianship, some might age out, but they said, the structure of those just don't always let us establish an ongoing caregiving relationship with an adult yet still maybe have access to some of those supports that youth aging out might have, and still being able to maintain maybe existing biological connections. So again, we're the first state in the nation to pass this legal permanency. I think we've had 4 permanencies at this point come through the SOL process. There are youth who have reached that legal permanency who, in the absence of that, likely would still be in our system until they age out. So again, very, very excited about that. That's obviously one we'll be looking closely at, and evaluating and, just really looking at kind of lessons learned from that. But again, thank you again for your support for that. So Prevention and Protection Services, I spent the most time on that because, as I said, it is our largest program from the standpoint of staffing, our largest program from the standpoint of funding, and also just because of its focus really on vulnerable children and adults. Our second area, kind of that second bucket of services, are child support services. And our Director of Child Support Services is Marcy Martinez. Our child support program really helps youth to receive the financial support necessary for their growth and development. The program establishes parentage and orders for child support, helps to locate non-custodial parents, enforces child support orders, works to modify child support orders as needed. We maintain a service center, and we also operate the Kansas Payment Center that child support payments, both those we administer as well as those through the courts go through. You can see on the slide, these numbers don't show up in our budget anywhere because this is funding that's going directly to families from child support. But if you think about $200 million that we help to facilitate going to families through the child support process. Child support as well is an area where there's really been a public-private partnership in Kansas for a long time. And in 2021, Kansas moved to expand that further, and we now have what we call 2 full-service contractors providing those child support services in Kansas. Those are Maximus and Young Williams. Maximus, there's also a map on the next page, is providing those services in Sedgwick and Wyandotte County. Young Williams is providing those services in the remainder of the state. The third area, and the one you probably hear the most about outside of prevention protection services, is economic and employment services. That's led by Dr. Carla Whiteside Hicks. These are really what you think of as the traditional benefit programs, sort of in the old language what folks might call the traditional welfare programs. But these are the cash assistance program through temporary assistance for needy families, where families can receive temporary cash assistance, food assistance through the federal SNAP program. And both of those the benefits are 100% federally funded. Child care assistance, employment assistance for individuals receiving those benefits, energy assistance through our LEAP program that just opened up, in fact, a few months ago for the winter season, really provides help with winter heating costs. And then the newest program that came out of one of the pieces of legislation, federal legislation in the last couple of years, is an emergency water assistance program that can help individuals keep their water hooked up. In terms of scope and scale of each of those, if there's a chart on page 16, you can see that our TANF program, in terms of cash assistance, is pretty small. In terms of actual recipients, in fiscal year 24, about 7,200 persons receiving that assistance. So fewer families. So that's in terms of the number of individuals. So about 9.7 million in actual cash assistance. TANF is funded through a federal block grant. It's not an entitlement program anymore. It's a specific amount, and it's been the same since the program came into effect about 20 years ago. And it is, Kansas gets about $104 million. As I said, we spend about $10 million on cash assistance. We spend some funding on employment assistance. Some of that money goes to support childcare, and then we have a number of grants related to supporting the goals of TANF around supporting families. The TANF cash assistance numbers really reflect, if we looked back over some larger caseload numbers, you would see that those numbers used to be quite larger. When the state passed the HOPE Act a few years ago, it put more restrictive time limits on the program than the federal program. So there's a 2-year time limit for folks to be on the program, as well as a number of other restrictions. Past years, if you go back, a decade or more, you might see 20 or 30,000 people on that program. But again, it's time limited, has some particular employment requirements associated with that. If you look about halfway down the page, you'll see SNAP food assistance. I call this out because this is really the largest from the benefit programs in terms of the number of Kansans impacted. So last year, 188,000 Kansans received SNAP assistance in some form. That was about $412 million. And I would say this doesn't show up in our budget. It's like an off-budget item, the food assistance, kind of like child support in this, that it is historically doesn't show up, or our budget would show up to be even larger than it is. But again, that's the largest program. The 23 numbers that were quite a bit larger had some enhanced funding related to the pandemic. And so that's why the numbers were larger. But again, just in terms of that scope and scale, you can also see the child care numbers in terms of about 13,000 average monthly children receiving some child care assistance through DCF, about $84 million, combination of federal child care block grant and some state funds as well. Our newest program in this arena is what's called the Summer EBT Assistance Program. You won't see any expenditures for prior years. Last year was really the first year. This is a new federal program that came out of, again, one of the recent federal relief acts, and then the program was made permanent. This provides kind of a one-time payment for children each month in the summertime who receive free and reduced school lunches during the school year. So again, kind of a new program. I did in terms of the benefit programs, we did want to just mention as well the various work programs that DCF has. When I talked about our mission and I talked about supporting adult self-sufficiency, focus on work and employment preparation and support in going to work is very important. So we have a number of programs both in support of TANF employment services for those cash assistance adults. They're required to engage in work programs 20 to 30 hours a week unless they meet certain very limited exceptions, maybe caring for a very young infant or certain disabilities. We had just over 900 new employments in fiscal year 24 for that small population. We also have programs attached to our food assistance population as well. So again, a number of employment programs within DCF. The last two on page 17 actually link to the fourth bucket of our services, vocational rehabilitation. And this gives some data about our vocational rehabilitation services, really helping about 970 people achieve competitive employment last year. And I'll switch to rehabilitation services. That's really our last bucket. But what rehabilitation services does is really helps Kansans with disabilities who need some supports or retraining to re-enter the workforce to do so. So we have vocational services, we have independent living services. We also have are responsible and get a small amount of federal funds to provide services for older Kansans who are blind or visually impaired. Someone may become blind even older in life. So we work with a number of private partners for kind of some of that, reorientation that folks need to have if they lose their vision. You can see in terms of numbers served that We have about 6,300 persons monthly receiving vocational rehabilitation services. Some of those might be in school, perhaps, learning a new skill or trade that they can do based on the disability that they have acquired. And again, about 970 achieved competitive employment last year. We also, within rehabilitation services, operate Kansas Disability Determination Services. So we're responsible under contract with the federal government of conducting all of the federal Social Security determinations for Kansas. We processed about 27,000 disability claims last year, a 98.9% accuracy rate. Very proud of that accuracy rate. Kansas receives awards for DDS kind of year after year for that accuracy rate. You think about when people are applying for disability, and you hear so much about the long process, and then you hear about the appeals when denials happen or things like that. So we're very proud of just that accuracy rate that we've really been able to maintain over a long period of time in Kansas. Almost finished here, Madam Chair. Just a couple slides, again, that just give you a context, of our overall budget. You're not a budget committee, so I won't spend a lot of time on these, but our budget that was approved last year was just under $1 billion, about half state dollars, half federal dollars. A little bit of Children's Initiatives Fund, but again, about half state, half federal. And as I said earlier, you've got a couple of bar charts that show that, prevention and protection services, that first bucket I talked about is really about half of our budget in total from all funding sources. The benefits programs, economic and employment support, are about a fifth of our budget, and you can see the rest of that. And it plays out pretty similarly if you look at the state dollars. The next slide just talks about the state general fund. For prevention and protection services, that's about 2/3 of our state budget. Because as I talked about before, the economic and employment support, that's almost all federally funded, again, with rehab services. So about 2/3 of that budget is the direct aid and assistance through prevention and protection services. The last budget page just talks about federal funds. Last year, child care was the largest in terms of the federal funds received by the state. Some of that still reflected some additional pandemic funds. After that, foster care and adoption funds followed closely by the TANF dollars, and then you can see the numbers going down. And as I said earlier, the SNAP benefits, the food assistance benefits, that $400 million, if that showed up as a budget item in Kansas, that would, be the largest item in our budget, but it's an off-budget item. Last thing I just wanted to say before questions is just what our legislative initiatives are this year. We have 3 priorities. They are all in the prevention and protection services area. We will have legislation related to secure care placements. Reducing the number of days a child in the custody of the secretary can be authorized for secure care placement by a court. Really lining that up with what the requirements are in juvenile justice. So lining up that for children in need of care for juvenile justice. A second one, to reduce the time frame for permanency hearings under the Child in Need of Care Code from 12 to 9 months. In Kansas, youth are staying in foster care longer than the national average, and we think that one of the things that might help with that in some dialogues that have kind of happened across systems over the last several months is to speed up those permanency hearings a bit. And then the last one has to do with making some modifications to how neglect is defined in our statute. I talked earlier about all of the work around prevention, and the more that we do that work, and the more that, we understand, not just in Kansas, but, nationally and collectively, that just entering into foster care can cause harm to families, that it's important that we really focus on, youth coming into care only if they need to. And so this would really refocus our statutes to make sure that poverty isn't confused with neglect, and prevent separation of a child from a parent solely due to poverty or other issues like truancy or the need for services. So again, we'll have 3 statutes. We're actually requesting their introduction this afternoon on the House side. So you'll see those later in the session. Last page, just we have 2 legislative reports. I think I had about 20 on the KDAD side, but I've listed the 2 reports that we've turned in, the Juvenile Crisis Intervention Center report, and then the other major one is the annual foster care report card. And we're still working with Department of Education, but that should be submitted to the legislature shortly in terms of the annual foster care report card that we do with Department of Education. I'll stand for any questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Committee, we do have a report from the Child Advocate, Carrie, who's here today. Want to be sure to give her enough time, so let's limit our questions to about 7 minutes. Are there any questions for the Secretary? Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Secretary. One of the initiatives this year in legislature is efficiency, controlling budgets and things of that nature. What kind of verification processes do we have for these benefits like SNAP or whatever that we're just providing those to Kansas citizens? Do you require proof of citizenship? What do you require?
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Senator. Yes, there are a lot of verification processes. Some of those are the actual documentation that we require, for example, proof of citizenship. And I would say, for most of our programs, there's either a citizenship requirement, sometimes there might be a permanent residency requirement, but we do a lot of data cross matches. So we're matching with federal agencies and others to verify those things, and we'd be happy to give the committee, I think we're actually working on this for another committee, just kind of a quick summary of what those matches look like and what those verifications look like.
I'd be interested in seeing that.
It is a very extensive process. We actually spend a large amount of resource on those cross matches and making sure that those verifications are in place.
Okay. Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Senator Thompson brought up a follow-up question to that. So how often do you do those verifications? For example, if someone qualifies and 6 months later, say they move out of state, how do we know that so that they don't continue to receive benefits from Kansas once they, how often do you do those eligibility checks?
Yeah, there are different cadences based on the program. So, why don't I put that in that response? There's also, and also the other example might be also if there's a death, things like that. So we also verify that as well, like with the Social Security Administration, so folks can come off the rolls. So, but I'll put that cadence on there because there are various reporting periods on the different benefits to make sure that folks are not receiving benefits they're not eligible for, and if they're no longer a Kansas resident. So.
Additional questions? Yes. Oh, yeah, I apologize. Senator Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Secretary Howard. During last session, there was a well-publicized case of a foster family being denied adoption. And I'm wondering how the intersection of Families First is enhance that option. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Families First is really a front-end service. So Families First referral to Family First would happen before a family would ever be, referred to foster care. So that's really a front-end prevention services. I would say maybe related to what you said, we have put a lot of emphasis and focus within our child welfare system on placement with relatives. And so we have a 50% goal, and we're actually reaching that in some regions. We're close to 50% now of children with relatives. So I do think your context of sort of those pieces of, the value of placement with relatives, but also the attachment that may happen from a foster care placement, and sometimes those difficult decisions that happen in adoption. I do think our emphasis on kin placements does have an impact on that when we make those decisions earlier in a case.
Thank you, Secretary. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here, Madam Secretary. Talk to me about, with regards to like foster care facilities, the frequency of the inspection process, what that looks like, how often do they occur? Do you let them know, or is it more or less like a surprise? Like, talk to me about that a little bit, because I have some concerns.
Sure. Thank you, Senator. You know, if it's all right with the chair, I might ask Deputy Secretary Keys to respond to that in a little bit more detail.
Thank you, Tanya Keys, Deputy Secretary. With regard to group residential boarding homes that we license, we would do annual reviews. We do have an ability to schedule those. We also can, without notice, show up, talk to them about their program, see how things are going on. Certainly, if we would receive concerns or an official complaint, we respond to those timely in the moment.
Thank you. Quick follow-up. So if you get a complaint or someone requests an investigation, do you notify the facility ahead of time? Or is it, you know, because some of the reports I'm hearing and getting, and I can talk to you more about this if you like later on, but are that there are facilities that go under investigation and then there's no issues found. So, and I don't mean this to come off in a disrespectful way, but is the facility notified, like, hey, we've got a complaint, we need to come out and look? Because like when I was in restaurants, if we knew they were coming, we would do a very thorough cleanup job. So when they came in, it looked beautiful. But if they showed up unannounced and surprised us, sometimes facilities can be caught kind of off guard and there are issues that wouldn't normally be discovered. So that's why I asked the question.
Sure, thank you for the question. I can verify our internal procedures. I believe we have a mechanism to do that, and certainly if we would need to be jointly investigating or coordinating with a law enforcement agency, we would do that as well. But let me get back to the committee on our formal policies and any exceptions to policies on notice, advance notice to a facility of our arrival.
And Senator Rose.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Secretary Howard. In light of the Trump administration's objective to make America healthy again, what changes do you anticipate making to the SNAP program to improve the health of Kansans and reduce chronic conditions?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Senator. You know, within the SNAP program today, there is some work that's done around kind of healthy eating and those things, and we have some contracts around that. There are no limitations in the SNAP program that might maybe specifically target certain food types, things like that. Like, for example, the WIC program for pregnant women has, you know, very certain specific things you can buy. There are some limitations on the food assistance program, but not related to the sort of piece that you're saying. So under existing law, you know, our major focus is really on what I would call nutrition education.
And last question, Secretary Erickson. Senator.
Thank you. I got promoted, I guess. Wow, thank you, Madam Chair. Very quickly, Madam Secretary, when will the Comprehensive Child Welfare System RFP winner be announced? Do we know yet?
We hope this quarter. It is in the final stages of procurement. I think we're still waiting for federal sign off. Yeah, the Federal Administration for Children and Families has to sign off on that. We have selected a vendor. We're in that final stages before we can announce it. The federal agency has to do that. So I hope that will be this quarter. I've been saying like this month, so now I'm saying this quarter, so I can hope to be right this time.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
We are in the final stages, so thank you.
Madam Secretary, one last question from me. So, of course, we're thrilled that the prevention that you've worked so hard on is helping to keep kids in their own homes and out of foster care. When I look at the chart that you gave us showing prevention and protection services, and I'm assuming protection services is foster care, correct? Like payment to foster care, payment to that whole program?
Yeah, also our front-end services, the actual, you know, child abuse the actual child abuse reports, investigations, and adult protective services.
Okay, so do we have, I know you don't have it with you today, but could you get back to us on the difference in the cost of prevention services compared to being in foster care?
Yes, yeah,
Okay, great.
absolutely. And definitely a significant difference in cost, but in the aggregate, we still are spending much more on foster care than prevention as a state.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And committee, now we're going to move to our final conferee. You all know her, Carrie Leonard. She's the acting Kansas Child Advocate. And Carrie, I hope to leave we have to finish at 25 after. This doesn't give you a lot of time, but I know from experience you usually don't take a lot of time. So welcome to committee.
Good morning, Madam Chair and Vice Chair and Ranking Minority and members of the committee. Thank you for having me this morning and giving me the opportunity to share a little bit about our office, give you some high-level just highlights of our annual report that came out, and some of the recommendations that we're going to be supporting in 2025 and moving forward based on our experience over the last several years. Okay, we have our slides up. Excellent. So if I just provided a quick introduction of myself for those of you who may be new or have not heard from me over the last several years about my background and how I came to this role. Next slide. So just a quick look back. I came into this role via the executive order in 2021 in the Division of the Child Advocate. And through the hard work of many of you that are here this morning, along with those in the Joint Committee and the support of our governor, Senate Bill 115 was passed last session, creating the Office of the Child Advocate, moving it from under the Department of Administration to its own independent office. It also, I think, more clearly delineated the authorities, the expectations, and the powers of the Office of the Child Advocate, and really set out why we're doing what we're doing and having a systemic change, an impact. Next slide. So the mission of the Office of the Child Advocate is to act as a neutral, independent agency to ensure Kansas children and families receive adequate coordination of services for child safety and well-being. And child welfare is complicated, and there are a lot of systems that are involved and that overlap. And so you'll find that in our recommendations, there are a number of initiatives that we have highlighted because of those overlaps within those systems. And I shared just the vision. I imagine that many of us here today probably have that same type of vision for our children, that their children are safe from harm, that our families have opportunities to thrive here in Kansas, and that change is effectuated through collaboration and working together for that comprehensive of services and innovation. And we also hope that our Kansans have trust in our systems and that they know that we're here to support them and that we're going to provide the services that we intend and are tasked with doing. So our office can be contacted both by phone and by an online intake through our website. Anyone can bring a complaint to us. So any professional, any concerned citizen, the number of youth that are starting to reach out to us is starting to increase, which is encouraging to us. That means that our information is getting out to those individuals. So what you'll see is that in 2024, the primary individuals that had reached out to our office are natural parents, foster parents, relatives. We also had child welfare professionals. Within the case, we had guardian ad litems, we had parents' attorneys, mental health providers, school professionals. So a number of different individuals who have reached out to our office with a concern regarding a child involved in our child welfare system. Next slide. So when someone contacts our office, we gather information. We want to make sure that it's within our scope. And within that process, we're always trying to identify what are the immediate needs within the situation. And if we can provide information, referral, and resources, we want to do that at the outset. And ongoing also as we're working with an individual. We also want to provide brief and immediate assistance whenever possible. So the earlier someone can come to us with a concern, the more opportunities our office has to hopefully have some impact, change the trajectory of a case, provide information and education, ask some challenging questions maybe of some of the providers to find out what is going on. And then we also then, depending on the situation, would open more of a comprehensive investigation. That entails gathering records from Department of Children and Families, our case management providers who are providing those foster care services or prevention services. It may involve mental health, talking with mental health providers that are providing services to the children and the parents. It may involve reviewing the court records. And I will say that that's something that has been critical with the change, with the legislation that was passed last session, is that we originally did not have direct access to the court records. And we find that we're utilizing that system quite often to really get a better understanding of what's going on, where the case is at procedurally, and to get some of that background information. So as a case is investigated, our goal then is to, once we finalize that case, more often than not, we have a formal written report that goes out. That's sent to the agencies, so Department for Children and Families, our case management providers. Moving forward, that could involve Department of Corrections based on our new scope within the Child Advocate Act. And within that, we're providing findings. So those findings based on the concerns that are brought to us are either supported or unsupported, and then we may provide recommendations. So you'll see that in 2024, we received 235 formal complaints that involved 377 children. We made 132 findings, and you'll see that 68 of those were supported, 22 were unsupported, but we still provided some recommendations. So it may have been a situation where we didn't support the concern, but we still had some things that we identified within that case and that review that we felt warranted recommendations or changes. And of those complaints, you'll see that those concerns included primarily Department for Children and Families, our case management providers, but it also included other partners. So our judicial court partners, we do receive concerns regarding the court process, law enforcement that may have been involved, KDHE, KDADS. We've heard some concerns regarding the interplay with some decisions that are made by the MCOs and how that impacts services that are being provided to a child, and then community health providers. Next slide. So this next chart really just shows your top concern categories. So consistently, the top concerns have included agency conduct and family separation and reunification. You'll see that child safety is on there, and then other issues also include concerns like I had mentioned regarding the judicial process. And you'll see that in our recommendations, both within what I'm providing here, as well as our annual report. At the end of the annual report, it lists out every recommendation that we've made in 2024. And so you'll note that most of those recommendations then will relate back to these top issues. Next slide. Something else that our office tries to be involved in, as we talk about, is that systemic advocacy and change. And so we do participate on a number of task forces and work groups and other initiatives throughout the state. So this just lists a number of those that our office is involved in. So including, currently I'm an ad hoc member of the JO Sync Advisory Committee that is looking at delivery of guardian ad litem and attorney services within the child welfare system. There's some other initiatives that you'll hear about on the Child Welfare Reimagined work groups have been very active the last several months in working together, coming up with a vision and then thinking about what steps we can take in the immediate as well as in the next 3 to 5 years. So this is where I'm going to spend, well, I was going to say a little bit more time, but I'll talk quickly. So you'll see this is just our takeaways for 2025 and beyond. So the first two you'll see are really around prevention, and they highlight presentations from KDADS and Department for Children and Families, because all of these things that are here we're seeing that they're impacting children and family, the services that they're receiving prior to coming in, or they're not receiving those services because they're not accessible or they're not available in their community, as well as once they enter the system. So there's a lot of interplay around prevention and then those services that may or may not be available then once they do enter the system. And so we highlighted those, and we would just encourage reviewing that information and thinking about ways that we can support a lot of these different programs that are available, or highlighting those that we may need to amplify or look at providing. The last one on the slide talks about initiatives around building a 24/7 access and communication pathways between Department for Children and Families and DCF. I'm sorry, and law enforcement. So in our annual report, there's a much more extensive section where we go into detail around what we're hearing regarding access. Department for Children and Families presently primarily is Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, and so, and then law enforcement obviously is 24/7. So what are some ways that we can improve that communication and access to make sure that we're providing the best possible response and services to families? The next slide. You heard from the secretary that they'll be proposing, that there will be a bill regarding that definition of neglect. That's something that our office supports, that conversation and that critical eye and look. One of the things that we would just encourage is that as we're looking at that definition and making hopefully some necessary changes within our statute, so that those that are responding can make the best possible decisions, that we're also considering just overall safety. And I think that there are, excuse me, there are some lessons learned from the State Child Death Review Board that as that discussion is happening, I would encourage folks to also then look at some of the findings in the State Child Death Review Board and recommendation that they've had over the last couple of years within that conversation. Some information or some recommendations around supporting programs, particularly around our high acuity youth, around placement stability and services. And skip to the next slide. We do recommend some potential statutory changes around concurrent planning. Again, in our annual report, there's a much more extensive section around that. And then as well as just the proposal that Secretary Howard regarding the frequency of permanency hearings. We would support that change to our statute. And then last slide are just some recommendations regarding that some court improvement initiatives. And so as you noted, as you may have recalled, one of our top concerns included the concerns around the judicial process. And so here are some recommendations that we have around that. And then on the last page, and I'm actually going to take, I'll just note, Senator Thomas had a question for the secretary earlier, and if you'll see that in the second bullet, these are recommendations that we have actually specifically made in those reports within 2024. And so we included those because they did include some potential legislative changes. And that one in particular does address the concern around inspections of congregate care settings and we're proposing that there should be a requirement that there be at minimum an annual unannounced inspection as well. And so that is a concern that we've heard and that we have looked at this last year. And Madam Chair, I know that we're short on time, and so at this time,
Well done, Carrie. Thank you
more than
so
happy to
much.
stand for questions.
Committee, I will tell you that we talked about Bob Bethel last time. I do chair the Child Welfare Joint Committee as well, and that'll be coming up here shortly. Carrie will be making an even more thorough, because we were short on time today, and look forward to hearing that, and thank you for all you do. Committee, do we have just a couple minutes for questions? Yes. Secretary, why do I keep saying Senator Murphy? At least I didn't say representative.
Promotions, I love it.
All over the place. Senator Murphy, thank you.
Carrie, I wanted to thank you. I spoke with you last year, early, before you even officially had this office and everything, and you helped with a situation, and I appreciate it.
That's good to hear. Thank you, Senator.
Senator Holscher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do have a question in regard to guardianship and conservatorship. When we're talking about a person being appointed to oversee certain children, is there a limit to the number that they can take on?
So, Senator, thank you for the question. And I want to make sure that I'm answering it correctly. So when we think about guardianship or conservatorship, that would be an order through the court, the probate court. And that would be typically someone who's essentially being appointed or named as the guardian who would act and step in really as a parent role. And so I don't know if you're thinking about that idea or if we're referencing more of the guardian ad litem attorney role who's representing the child's best interest in the child needing.
Yeah, no, I am talking more of the court-appointed, where we're talking about conservatorship. And like I said, I'm just curious if there's a limit to the number of times that a person can be appointed to that role.
I'm not aware of a limit, but that's probably a little bit out of my expertise and scope, but I'm not aware of a limit. That's something that typically, at least when I was practicing, that the court would just consider as far as when they were making that order, whether it was in the best interest of the child.
And one last quick question from Senator Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Real quick, I just want to make sure I heard you right. Are you saying that there are no current unannounced inspections of some of these facilities right now?
Senator, thank you for the question. It's my, and I can bring back more specifically the recommendations that we had made in that particular situation. But my understanding is that there are required annual inspections, typically, and complaint-based inspections. But there is no statutory requirement that we're aware of or found that requires an annual unannounced inspection. And that was something that we recommended be reviewed and considered.
Carrie, thank you for being with us. Thank you, committee, and we are adjourned.